Are you blind?
All right, everyone, we're gonna get started. So I will introduce our two speakers.
I think there's like.
Oh, I'm gonna make some terrible noises with this. Okay, so our first speaker today, or for this session, is going to be Rohn. She is executive director for OutFront Minnesota, Minnesota's largest LGBTQ+ advocacy organization. Kat joined the organization in 2022 after spending more than a decade in higher education fundraising work. Kat has long been passionate about LGBTQ+ issues and engaged in making change from the workplace to local communities. Kat lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, with their partner and 2 kids. And then Catherine S.V. Cashel, known as Katie, has been an attorney in solo practice in Minnesota for 20 years. She practices in the areas of family law, helping clients through a divorce using the collaborative law process to resolve differences and keep parents out of court whenever possible. She helps transgender people with their legal name and gender designation changes, and she also drafts wills and other basic estate planning documents. She's a member of the Minnesota Lavender Bar Association. And prior to her legal career, Katie was a lobbyist at the Minnesota State Capitol on healthcare issues. She cut her teeth lobbying for healthcare reform in the early 90s on the Health Right Bill, which became the Minnesota Care Health Insurance Program. And she served as the director of governmental relations for the Minnesota Chiropractic Association for 8 years.
Take this so that folks can hear me online. As I was introduced to Kat Rohn, they, she pronouns, executive director for OutFront Minnesota, our state's largest LGBTQ advocacy organization. And it's a pleasure today. I think about last year, I gave a presentation at All Gender Health, kind of setting the stage for what happened this year, but it was all still very much in a space of like speculation. We were in a space of like, we don't know exactly what's going to happen nationally. We don't know what's going to happen here in Minnesota. We don't even know who we're going to be working with and whether or not they're going to be in a place to support this work. And in a world that we arrived to today, we are in a very different place, both nationally here in Minnesota, and that's a good and a bad thing. I think just to kind of set the stage and context, I'm sure most of you are super familiar with the landscape, but we are looking at a world in which almost half of the United States has passed a gender-affirming care ban. For some of those extend in different logistical and legal ways into adult care spaces as well. But we have moved from a world only 2 or 3 years ago where these laws were just being drafted and ideated to now having nearly half the United States have them enacted. There's a patchwork of some that have been enjoined currently, some that are, you know, in weird spaces of grandfather clauses and things like that that allow some folks to get care. But basically, if you go from Minnesota and drive across the country, you are going to have vastly different experiences with what you can access based on the laws of that state. And that was exactly our fear last year when we began these conversations around what can we do here in Minnesota and what will be possible here in Minnesota this year. Last fall, when I was talking both with our legislators, folks who were campaigning with the governor's office, one thing was abundantly clear to me. One, that there was will here within Minnesota to do something to support LGBTQ rights writ large. And what exactly that looked like was still kind of taking shape, but we hedged our bets and as an organization called for 2 things that we knew we were going to both push as far as we could get to. One was an executive order to basically do similar to how the governor had done just in the wake of the Dobbs decision around abortion and reproductive care here in the state, to just affirm, even if it was symbolic at a state level, to say that we won't comply with these harmful laws, that Minnesota's values are different, that we as a state believe that this care is best practice care and that folks should have access to it. At the same time, we were working deeply with a number of different legislative partners around drafting something that would be more solid, more permanent, more meaningful in some ways. And that was a bill around trans refuge here in the state. It has subsequently passed and been signed into law. But at the time, we were both deeply unsure. One, this was new territory. There have been a handful of states that, sort of predated Minnesota with refuge legislation. Some of it, like California's, was seen as really messy and legally complicated. Some of it was, just basically a tack-on addendum to abortion shield bills in other states. And we thought it was deeply important for ours to stand on its own, not because we saw this as in contrast to work being done around reproductive care. To the contrast to that, like we see these as deeply intertwined, but what we wanted to do was make sure that we were getting in the nuance within the language of the law itself to address specific and direct concerns within gender affirming care that are somewhat different from reproductive care, even if the frames are the same. And there is a reason, not just by convenience. In fact, I would argue it's maybe inconvenient from a sort of political lens, but there was a reason that we passed these bills through the Senate on the same day. And it was because we wanted, and legislators wanted, to draw the clear connection that bodily autonomy and the right to make medical choices for yourself are the same, whether we're talking about abortion care or gender affirming health care. And they were signed into law by the governor on the same day, along with our ban on conversion therapy here in Minnesota, something that our organization has been working towards for the last 9 years. As a sort of broader statement about Minnesota's values. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is law can have a lot of different purposes. One is simply to protect rights or make investments or expand or change the way that the state acts. But part of it is also about signaling and symbolism. And I believe Minnesota's Trans Refuge Bill does a little bit of both. One is purely that symbolism piece. One of the things that I heard loud and clear when I talked to trans folks in Minnesota, but especially when I was talking to my colleagues and partners in state organizations across the country, but especially our neighbors, Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, where these bills were almost certainly going to be introduced and passed. The writing was clearly on the wall for that. The language was drafted, the votes were in place. We weren't expecting any significant upsets in any of those states in terms of that political dynamic. One thing that was abundantly clear to me was that folks were looking for a sign of hope in the middle of, what is now more than 600 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been introduced this year, more than 80 that have passed into law in states across this country, right? And gender affirming care was a particular space where folks wanted to see states standing clearly and see leadership standing clearly on this, not just on the coasts, because I think from a sort of symbolism lens, there's a real power to what we do in the Midwest. For better or worse, we're seen as being different from sort of coastal elites. And so being able to step into this space and say, we're doing something in the space that this aligns with Midwestern values is a way to make a narrative framework shift. And I don't want to undersell the importance of making narrative framework shifts, both in the space of the broader cultural climate and what that means for individuals. I can tell you about stories of families who have personally called me and talked to me, not because the law changed dramatically what they were able to access. They could have come to Minnesota for care before, and it was unlikely that any of these states would have pursued them in the current frame, and two, that there would have been any barriers from care providers here, but it gave that extra assurance. And I can tell you, multiple families called us, told us that what we were doing was giving them hope at a time when they needed it most. And that matters a lot, right? But I think the other piece when we think about narrative frame shifts is that there's an actual political and legislative and judicial capital that comes along with changing the narrative frame. We didn't get to marriage equality at a national level just because we had the best legal arguments. Those were very helpful and necessary and important, right? But here within Minnesota, we got to marriage equality by changing the narrative frame. Minnesotans were ready to ban in our constitution same-sex marriage, and the polling was indicating that we were going to go in that direction, right? But Minnesotans stepped up and engaged in a campaign of changing the cultural narrative, not the legal framework, but the cultural narrative around it, which then led to these cascading effects of defeating that, of passing marriage equality here, and then leading to a world now in which we now have, marriage equality being affirmed by a majority of senators at the United States level. That is a cultural frame shift that has led to policy frame shifts, right? And the Supreme Court affirming marriage equality at a national level, even if it's still in question today as the Supreme Court's composition has changed, is a representation not just of like the legal arguments got better and now the Supreme Court understands them better, but it is a representation of how our cultural understanding of these issues shifts and then causes shifts in interpretation of law. And I would make the argument that cultural frame shifts are the most important work that we can do when it comes to ensuring people's rights, because I can pass any number of laws and I can say that the law of the land is X, Y, Z. The Minnesota Human Rights Act, great example of a monumentally important act that has done tremendous and deep work for our communities here in the state of Minnesota. We were one of the first states in the country to add fully inclusive LGBTQ protections at a state level. And that has played out across all sorts of lawsuits, all sorts of policy changes, all sorts of things. But still today, 30 years later, I get calls on a weekly basis from folks who are experiencing discrimination in workplaces or housing. Right? It's been the law of the land for decades. And still, the cultural frame shift around treating LGBTQ people with full equity and equality is not there yet for every Minnesotan. And so, not to diminish the important work of any of this, policy change that happens, but to say that we need to do both in tandem. And that oftentimes when we engage effectively in culture change first, the policy falls into place with more strength and security and certainty. And so as an organization, I think it's important, we worked on about 25 bills that in some way touch on LGBTQ lives this legislative session. I've got another 25 or so that are in my docket for things that we're hoping to explore in 2024. But at the same time, we are threading through all of that a sense of how do we talk about this legislation? One of the things that I did when we were putting together the folks who were testifying for some of these bills was both make sure that we were highlighting the experiences of folks who were affected. So from other states, from here in Minnesota on a personal level, but also make sure that trans voices and trans expertise was centered in these conversations. One of the things that I've seen at a sort of national cultural level is that oftentimes those two are treated as separate. One, that trans people and trans youth are seen as sort of impact stories, right? Like these are the folks who will be affected by this bill. You're going to speak to your personal experience, but they are not seen as the experts or agents in this, right? And so having trans folks who have legal backgrounds and can talk about the impacts of this law on a personal level, but also on that legal framework level. Having trans folks who have medical expertise who can talk about what this means for them, but also what it looks like professionally, changes, again, that narrative frame shift. We're not just talking about trans folks as victims, we're talking about trans folks as agents in passing and advancing policy that we need for our bodies and our lives. And that's about changing that narrative frame, empowering communities, building policy that reflects our needs, and at the same time, getting leadership to affirmatively and loudly support LGBTQ rights at a time when I know all over the country, and I don't know how many folks have seen HRC's sort of survey climate data, but 74% of LGBTQ adults feel less safe because of the legislation that's being passed today. 91% of trans adults feel the same. That impact left unchecked is going to lead to all sorts of detrimental health outcomes for folks. And that is going to lead to all sorts of unintended harms. And it's going to lead to folks withdrawing from public life, which, to be clear, is the goal of the opposition to LGBTQ rights. It's not about passing a particular law. It's not about banning a particular set of care. It is about slowly, but certainly pushing LGBTQ folks writ large out of the public space. That is their goal. And that is what they're working to. And gender affirming care bans were simply the easiest, lowest hanging fruit for them to do this with. But they've moved on to schools, they've moved on to bathrooms, they've moved on to all these sorts of things in different spaces to see what will stick and to see what they can move forward. And they will keep doing that until we win the culture change narrative here. So here in Minnesota, I'm deeply proud of the work on the Trans Refuge Bill. I think it is both symbolic in many regards. It's about reaffirming what is a longstanding commitment in this state to supporting LGBTQ folks, and honestly to supporting trans folks with the work of the Minnesota Human Rights Act and with many decades worth of conversations and state policy changes and litigation that has affirmed here in Minnesota that we do have those supports. And I think it both put Minnesota on a national landscape level in a different way than we have been for the last decade. But it is also about sort of setting up that next series of wins, of getting folks to take a values-based message and applying it to a whole host of other equity issues, right? And I think one of the biggest pieces that we knew through the process of the Trans Refuge Bill was that this was an important piece of legislation, but in some ways it was a promise to the next generation of Minnesotans, not to say like, hey, we're going to take care of you and everything will be fine. It won't be. Things will be really difficult for the next decade. But it is a promise to say this is a starting point for our work, right? Refuge is a thing that is meaningful and real for folks. If a state were to pursue somebody in the ways that this bill protects them from, this bill would have real teeth. We hope sincerely that states won't do the things that we're trying to protect against. But we wrote those into the law because we've seen them do this in other spaces, particularly around abortion. And on the other hand, the law doesn't make any investments in what we know are deep disparities in access to care here in the state that are only being exacerbated by more folks coming and needing the support here in Minnesota. So the promise of this bill is about saying, here's a starting point that we're going to make sure that we protect this, but what it means to expand access to care to truly be a refuge to folks is about more than just one particular bill protecting against harmful laws from another state. That's like a Band-Aid on a national problem in some ways. It's an important one. Don't get me wrong, we needed some kind of response or people were going to be left feeling like nothing was happening and the world is hopeless and my life is only going to get worse from today. That is deeply important, but it is also a promise and a commitment from organizations like ours to say, what then does it look like to be a refuge? And that's about investing in organizations, that's about building structures of care, that's about getting folks the resources that they need to actually feel that sense of refuge here in Minnesota. And that's a harder sell. That's a deeper set of work. It's not just about one particular piece of legislation. It's about a whole bunch of investments in a whole bunch of areas that will take some time to come to fruition. I can't snap my fingers, even with $50 million, and suddenly have trans folks have access to care without barriers as they need it in the state all the time. But we can take steps in that direction. And using this culture shift framework as the starting point is an important way to get that work going and to say, you all made a commitment to Minnesotans and our neighbors to move this forward. Let's fulfill that promise. Yeah. And as we look across the country today, and especially, as I was kind of preparing my, thoughts for this, looking at our neighbor to the east, Wisconsin, where they introduced and quickly passed through both chambers a gender affirming care ban. It's expected to be vetoed by the governor. We understand from our partners there that there's not enough votes currently to override, but fingers crossed that will hold. I think we have to be honest and realistic about the prospect that when legislative changes occur in composition, that this may get worse in the short term. Right? I think we are going to see other states try and ban gender affirming care for adults. Things are going to get worse for people in the short term. We are going to see Congress at a federal level continue to introduce legislation to try and ban gender affirming care. right? That national rhetoric is only going to amplify. So it's incumbent on us to do the work we can in Minnesota, both to protect what we have today, but to invest in that deeper change so that a decade from now, we're having a very different conversation about Minnesota and a very different conversation about our nation.
Wow. Whoa. Thank you, Kat. Do I need a microphone or can everyone hear me?